Civilians are still dying. Syria's bombardment of Eastern Ghouta with no sign of aid deliveries or evacuations despite Russia's promised humanitarian pause. 7 people died on the ceasefire's first day, which began at 9 a.m. local time on Tuesday. After the Russian-backed regime broke the 5-hour truce an hour early. This Russian truce is a farce. Russia is killing us and bombing us every day, said Samir al-Buaidhani, a 25-year-old from Douma, Eastern Ghouta's main hub. I don't believe it's safe for me or my family to leave by this system. Many of the more than 400,000 civilians were trapped in the wreckage of their own homes and bled to death as even rescuers were targeted. Moscow's plan falls short of a broader 30-day ceasefire it agreed to at the United Nations Security Council but which has yet to take effect, and inspired little trust from among the besieged enclave's residents. Syria deployed buses to transport residents wanting to use a humanitarian corridor to flee what UN Chief Antonio Guterres called hell on earth. But no civilians were seen venturing towards the regime forces guarding the checkpoint, where large portraits of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Russian President Vladimir Putin could be seen side by side. The humanitarian pause echoed a similar tactic employed by Russia and Syrian regime during the ferocious battle to force rebels out of Aleppo in 2016. Russia's defense ministry accused armed groups in Eastern Ghouta of shelling the corridor, and said rebel fighters had continued attacking the positions of the government forces and went on the offensive in other directions too. These are the militants, including terror groups, who counter the government and are creating problems linked to prioritization of this decision, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said. There are also forces supporting the anti-government opposition in Syria behind it. He said Western countries should start with themselves and fulfill the UN Security Council Resolution 2401 on a humanitarian pause in Syria. They continue screaming that it is allegedly impossible to implement in Eastern Ghouta what is written down in the Resolution 2401, he said. The resolution needs to be implemented in full. They should start with themselves. We will constantly repeat to our US and French colleagues, start with yourselves. Mr. Ryabkov hit back at accusations by the West that Syrian and Russian bombardment of Eastern Ghouta was killing civilians. Those who divide the world under a friend or foe principle regardless of what their people do and the methods they use. Whether they are terrorists or not, they will still remain friends for these people, he said. U.S. State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert claimed Russia was not truly committed to any ceasefire. They're not adhering to the ceasefire because they continue to sponsor and back Bashar al-Assad's government, she said. Syrian state news agency SANA said a former al-Qaeda affiliate present in the enclave was blocking civilians to use them as human shields. International Committee of the Red Cross spokeswoman Yolanda Jacquimet said any evacuation needed deeper coordination. Under international humanitarian law, humanitarian corridors are things which need to be well planned and must be implemented with the consent of parties on all sides. Not only with one side, she said. Since February 18, 582 civilians, almost a quarter of them children, have been killed in the Syrian and Russian bombardment of Eastern Ghouta, making it one of the bloodiest episodes of the country's 7-year-old conflict. 14 of the dead, including 5 children, were pulled from the rubble on Tuesday after being killed in the past 2 days, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights War Monitor said. In Damascus, the state news agency said a civilian was killed and 5 others wounded by shelling from terrorist organizations. In Hamurayu, another town in the sprawling semi-rural enclave, Mohammed Abdullah said the pause left civilians with a choice between 2 evils. The truce is not in the people's interest. We have 2 options, death or displacement, the 30-year-old said. The campaign we were targeted with was an extermination campaign, not a simple bombardment. What we want is a full and permanent ceasefire for all of Ghouta, he said. That sentiment was echoed by the dominant rebel groups in Eastern Ghouta, who sent a letter to the United Nations stating their willingness to expel jihadists as soon as a full ceasefire takes effect. The letter said such an evacuation, which has been discussed previously but never yielded any result, would take 15 days and start when a UN truce takes effect. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reacted cautiously to the statement and said after meeting French counterpart Jean-Yves Le Drian that the ball was in the rebel group's court. We shall see in practice whether the pleas by the three illegal armed groups to carry out the UNSC resolution correspond with their intentions, he said. A top U.S. general accused Moscow of playing an incredibly destabilizing role in Syria by claiming it wants to settle the civil war while at the same time stoking the conflict. The UN Security Council will meet Wednesday afternoon to discuss the humanitarian situation and hear from UN Aid Chief Mark Lowcock. The Syrian government lost control of Eastern Ghouta area of Damascus in 2012 and has besieged it almost ever since. The latest scenario put in place by the regime and its Russian ally was reminiscent of the deal that ended the Battle of Aleppo in 2016. Few civilians back then initially used the Aleppo corridors unilaterally announced by Russia. Some started fleeing after renewed bombardment and the rest eventually evacuated when a multilateral deal was reached with Turkey.
Tell me where the freaks at.